At his father's retirement home, a billionaire CEO is greeted by a little boy. "Hey, sir, are you here to see your grandpa too?" He chuckles. "No, just my dad." The boy grins. "You've got to meet my grandpa. He's in room 407, and I'm still a bit shocked that he's here." Hey everyone, before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. Hey, if you could give this video a thumbs up, that would really help the channel out. Now, just kick back and relax. Enjoy the story. Patrick Carroll didn't usually make time for this kind of thing. The retirement home was just a 20-minute drive from his office, but it felt like it was worlds away. He hadn't seen his father in almost a year. Not since that awkward holiday visit that ended up being pretty uncomfortable. It was a chat and a quiet, leisurely stroll back to the elevator. Walter Carroll had always. "I've noticed a stronger presence lately, even if it seems like there's this looming discipline that's just impossible to ignore." Patrick had spent most of his life trying to steer clear of becoming that person, but every time he glanced in the mirror, it was like he was staring right at him. Lately, he's been seeing those familiar tired lines around the mouth, those stiff shoulders, and that same frustrating silence when his emotions were bubbling up as he signed in at the front desk. Not even bothering to smile. He was already regretting this decision. His assistant had mentioned that Walter's birthday was just around the corner, and Patrick thought he could fit in a visit now and get it over with. He had a board meeting in 2 hours and a business dinner tonight, and somewhere in between. He was meant to eat, sleep, and keep his sanity intact. The lobby felt warm, too. It's warm, with beige furniture and a piano sitting in the corner that nobody ever plays. It smelled like lavender and overcooked carrots. He was just about to pull out his phone when a small voice chimed in beside him. "Hey, sir, are you here to see your grandpa too?" Patrick looked down, startled. A little boy was standing by the vending machine, clutching a bag of pretzels in one hand and a juice box in the other. His shirt was half untucked, hair wild, and his bright, curious eyes were locked on something. On Patrick, like he just discovered someone really interesting to chat with. Not quite Patrick. He said with a half smile, "I'm here to see my dad." The boy tilted his head, thinking about that. "Oh, mine's not here. It's just my grandpa. He's in the room." For 07, Patrick opened his mouth, then closed it again for a moment. The name of the room didn't. So I registered, and then it hit me sharp and sudden. Room 407, Walter's room. It definitely wasn't your typical place. He had memorized it out of necessity. Not because of any feelings. He just stared at it. The boy was trying to figure it all out. "Are you really sure about that number?" "Yep, for 07, the boy said proudly. "Hey, remember how it's just like my locker at school, but flipped?" He took a loud sip from the juice box and then added, "You've got to meet my grandpa. He's super funny and always gives me peppermints when Grandma's not looking." Patrick forced a laugh, keeping it light and casual, even though my stomach started to churn. Maybe it was just a coincidence, or maybe the boy had gotten to me. It's possible Walter has a roommate now, or maybe he doesn't. Just let that thought linger. There's really no reason to go down that road until he has something solid, the boy. He waved and quickly dashed away before Patrick could ask anything more. Patrick watched him make his way toward the hallway that led to the. Patrick was skipping down the residential wing, his sneakers squeaking on the tile. He followed slowly, frowning. And when he turned the corner, he stopped short just as the boy reached the door to 47. The kid just threw it open without knocking and jumped right in. A woman's voice playfully called out. And then she appeared, a woman in her 30s, with dark hair, wearing jeans and a loose top. The boy was cradled on her hip, wrapped in a sweater, and she looked nothing like anyone else. Patrick had never seen anything like it before. Then she turned, and there was Walter sitting upright in front of her. His recliner was draped in a cardigan that Patrick hadn't noticed before. He looked older than the last time, thinner, but what surprised Patrick wasn't the frailty. It was the warmth in Walter's expression. Walter was smiling. With a big smile, he got up to greet them, placing a hand on the boy's head and saying something that Patrick couldn't quite catch. He pulled the woman into a one-armed hug, and she leaned in right away. Patrick took a step back then. He pressed himself against the wall, just out of sight, his heart thumping harder than it should have been for a guy with his resting pulse couldn't catch every word. But the tone was definitely familiar, warm, and relaxed. The woman laughed again at something Walter said, touching his arm and calling him Dad. It definitely wasn't a slip. It wasn't a joke. Patrick just stood there for what felt like a long time, maybe a full minute. Who knows? He hardly noticed when another resident shuffled by with a walker. His mind was already racing, trying to piece together a timeline that just didn't add up. His father never had a daughter, not one he ever recognized. Patrick would. If he and his siblings, Jake and Alice, had known, they would have found out there would. I've been hearing whispers, like there's a hint of something, but honestly, there hasn't been anything at all. So, there was this woman calling Walter Dad, and a boy who had his room number all memorized. With a grin that just wouldn't leave his face, Patrick turned and walked out, his boots thudding heavily on the tile as he passed the front desk. The clerk asked if everything was okay, but he didn't respond. Outside, the wind hit him in the face. He got in the car, sat there without moving, the engine off, his hands resting still. Gripping the wheel, Claire, that had to be her name. He heard the boy say it, and he kept replaying it in his head like a song on repeat. Walter was hugging her. Then he touched the boy's hair, and he had this grin on his face like he never had before. Once, he smiled at his own son. Patrick had always thought his father was a closed book, full of sharp corners and rigid silence. So, it turns out there was this whole hidden chapter, maybe even an entire volume, that he had never seen before, a secret that somehow managed to stay under the radar, breathed in plain sight. And he had no clue how long it had been happening. He could have gone back, knocked on the door, and demanded answers, but he didn't. Not today. Not yet. He needed to think, needed some space. So, he started the car and pulled out. Of the lot, tires crunching over gravel, Patrick Carlisle didn't usually take the time. For this kind of situation, he definitely wasn't going to let it slide. Patrick was barely hanging on. After his visit to the retirement home, he slept through the night, but the image of CLA cradling that boy in Walter's room lingered in his mind. It popped up in his mind, especially when everything else had gone quiet, like during those moments in the back of the car when there were no emails coming in. Even while brushing his teeth. The boy's voice was cheerful and certain in room 407. It kept playing back like a weird echo that just wouldn't quit, and he tried to brush it off. He threw himself into work, packed his calendar, and acted like it was something that could hold off. But by the third day he just couldn't help it. It was too big, too strange, and the more he pondered it really got under his skin. Not just the secret itself, but how easy and casual Walter was about it, like it was no big deal. Grandpa in a cardigan was laughing, like he never made his own kids feel small. What gave him the... So, Patrick didn't give us a heads up. He just showed up in the early afternoon and walked in. He passed the front desk with a quick nod and headed straight to 407. This time, he didn't hesitate. He knocked hard once and then opened the door before anyone could answer. Walter glanced up from the crossword puzzle he had in his lap. "Patrick," he said, a bit surprised but not really unhappy. "Didn't expect to see you." "Hey, you're back already. We really need to chat about Walter's expression." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly, folded the paper, and set it aside. "All right, Patrick," he said. He stepped in and shut the door behind him, arms crossed and jaw tight. "I noticed her there." Claire Walter didn't say a word, and Malik remained quiet too. Just a soft sound in the background. He shifted in the chair and let out a slight exhale. Patrick really hated how calm he looked. He'd been expecting this moment eventually, just not today. "She called you Dad, and Patrick said you hugged her. Kissed your grandson on the head? Huh? So, how long has this been happening, Walter?" He rubbed his temple and leaned back a bit. Patrick waited for a long time, but Walter didn't go into detail. "You might want to be a bit clearer than that." Walter glanced over. "The window CLA came into existence the year after your mom passed, and that hit even harder than Patrick expected." He blinked once, sharply. "You had an affair while we were." "She's still choosing her headstone." "Well, it was after, but not too long after Patrick." "So, you laughed just once, a bit bitterly, and kept that secret for, what, 35 years? That's when Walter met. Right?" His eyes, "Yeah. Why?" Walter shifted in his seat. "The chair would have ruined what little I had left, and that was you, Alice. Hey, Jake, I was really struggling to keep it together. Her mom just wanted to avoid any trouble, you know? I didn't want anything. We had an agreement, and I supported them behind the scenes. So, I was thinking it was the right thing to do when Patrick stepped forward. Did you really think it was best to keep your daughter hidden away like some sort of side project? Does she even know we exist?" Walter hesitated, saying yes. She knows, but she never pushed. He respected the boundaries and started pacing a short line between the bed and the chair. You had another kid, a daughter. So, you just had her hidden away while the rest of us were sitting around, wondering what was going on. Our dad just couldn't be bothered to be around for half of our lives. It was complicated. Walter mentioned he did what he thought was best, but Patrick just shook his head and said, "No, you didn't. What was the easiest part? You just buried it and acted like it never happened, right?" Walters, with a softer voice, "I didn't just pretend to visit. I genuinely supported her and cared for her." "Did you? Did you ever take her to a baseball game?" Patrick snapped. "Did you ever actually show up for her?" "Hey, I could really use some help with my homework for the school play. I can't quite recall you doing that for me before, but I'm hoping you can lend a hand now. I noticed how you looked at her, and I saw you hug that boy. That's not the guy I grew up with, Walter. And we didn't talk for a long time. But when he finally did speak, it was something else." She slipped out quietly, and Patrick stared in disbelief. "She reminded me of someone. Your mother, Walter." Brought her smile and her sense of humor. "I wasn't sure how to. I raised you three on my own. I was angry, grieving, and trying to be strong, but I didn't. Back then with Claire, it was a different vibe. I really let myself be. It's different. You never showed us that side of you, not even once." "I know, Patrick." Leaning against the wall, I let out a slow breath. "So, Alice and Jake, what's the deal?" No, not like that. Outside this room, it was never meant to be known." Patrick pushed off the wall, heart pounding again. "Well, now it is." Walter looked down. "What are you planning to do?" "I haven't made up my mind yet." Patrick just left without saying anything else. With a stiff back and a pounding head, he drove toward the retirement home later that day. He parked across the street from a small park just a few blocks away, and it had a jungle gym. He spotted 2.5 benches along with a tree that still hadn't given up yet. CLA was sitting on the bench, watching Malik sprint from one end of the playground to the other, with Kate fluttering behind him, shouting something about being quicker than lightning. CLA took a sip from a paper coffee cup. She kept glancing at her phone now and then, but her focus was always on Malik. She looked a bit tired, yet somehow relaxed. Patrick stayed close by. In the car, he felt a bit unsure about why he had even come. Maybe it was curiosity. He just watched her. We all couldn't help but laugh when Malik tripped and rolled dramatically into the grass. After a moment, he got up and approached Mick slowly. I spotted him right away. At first, I squinted, but then I lit up and said, "Hey, it's you." CLA turned sharply and stood there. She gently placed a protective hand on Malik's shoulder and said, "Hi, Patrick," with care. "I just wanted to say, sorry for interrupting. I recognized you from the other day." Claire didn't smile. "Do we know why?" "I've met Walter a few times." Her mouth tightened a bit. I'm Patrick," she said, giving a quick nod. Claire Malik tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, this is the guy from the lobby I told you about. So, you know the one with the serious coat?" Patrick just kind of shrugged, looking a bit guilty. Claire kept her eyes steady. "So, you're a friend of Walter's, huh? Something like that?" She watched him for a moment and then waved toward the empty side of the bench. "Well, Patrick, feel free to sit." And he did. He was unsure about why he was there and what he planned to say, while CLA stood there with arms crossed. Malik climbed up onto the play structure and shouted that he was going to jump. CLA quickly turned and yelled for him not to. She sighed when he ignored her and flopped into the sand. "I didn't know Walter had other friends," she said afterward. "It seems like there's a pause. And I'm not sure he really gets it." Her eyebrows go up, which is kind of interesting. Patrick smiled a little and then glanced at the boy. "He's a good kid. They sat in silence for a moment. The kind that felt heavy but not quite oppressive. Feeling a bit uncomfortable, Patrick stood up after a while. "Well, I should go," he said. Claire nodded. "Nice. It was nice to meet you, Patrick." He walked back to his car, his thoughts all over the place. Nothing about her matched the way he imagined things. She wasn't entitled or bitter. She was nothing like that. Walter, if anything. She was the kind of parent he had always wished he could have had, and that boy was his nephew, and honestly, he just wasn't prepared for that reality. But it just wasn't moving forward. Patrick couldn't shake off the conversation with Claire. She hadn't really pushed it. For answers, Pride didn't even seem all that curious about him. Courteous yet detached. as if accustomed to handling expectations that often fall short. Malik had been more open and full of energy, asking questions freely, but CLA had. She kept her distance. Maybe it was just instinct. Or perhaps she already understood what she meant, or didn't mean, to the others. The Caro family. He hadn't let her in on who he really was. She probably figured it out by now. Walter might have said something, or maybe Malik figured it out. Either way, the truth didn't really matter. It was creeping out of the shadows, whether anyone was prepared or not. Walter's 78th birthday arrived just 4 days later. Alice set up a dinner at a fancy Italian restaurant in the city, and it even had a private room with champagne. Jake flew in from Chicago with pre-selected entree and cards that had a gold trim. Patrick showed up a few minutes late, acting like he was doing everyone a favor just by being there. And he snagged the last one. An empty seat next to his sister, who was brushing off her thin smile, while her husband gave him the usual nod. It didn't mean a thing. He hardly glanced at Walter, who was sitting at the head of the table with a big smile on his face. Like a guy who had no clue the walls were about to come crashing down, Walter was really in his element, chatting away, laughing effortlessly, and even tossing in a few jokes. Alice tried out a couple of dry jokes that actually landed. At one point, she clinked her fork on her wine glass to toast him. Jake raised his own hand with an exaggerated here, which got a few chuckles from someone. Snapped a photo, and for a few minutes, it seemed like a family that had always gotten along. Like nothing had ever gone wrong. Patrick sat through it, putting on smiles when necessary and sipping just enough. To stay calm, he kept glancing at the clock, and at 7:42, a server came out. The cake has 3 tiers, with vanilla and raspberry flavors, and a cheerful, happy 78th on it. Walter chimed in, and Alice clapped. Then, someone switched on their phone. Walter waved his hands modestly, like someone who has never sought attention in his life. Patrick. He stood up before we cut the cake and said, raising his glass, I'd like to say. Walter was still grinning as he looked up. Alice turned toward him, her eyes full of expectation. Jake had just taken a. He took a bite of tiramisu and raised an eyebrow at Patrick, who cleared his throat to address Dad. He said, and when he mentioned CLA, the name landed on the table like a sharp knife, making Walter smile. Faded before the others even had time to notice. Patrick just kept going. Hey, you never said anything about your daughter enjoying her slice of cake. And wow, Alice's glass really hit the table hard. Poor Jake. He coughed so violently after that. As someone was choking on wine, one of the cousins leaned in closer to his phone, unsure if he should stop recording or just keep it rolling. Walter didn't move. He hung in the air for a second, then lowered with a clink. Alice whispered softly against his plate. What Patrick didn't flinch, he said. He was clearly born after his mom passed away. Raised in secret and quietly supported. She calls him Dad. Her son calls him Grandpa. They live right here in the city. She's a lovely woman. What a bright kid. I had no clue they were around until just a week ago. Ed. The room went quiet, and you could feel the weight of all those years of hidden resentment hanging in the air. The quiet slights and emotional gaps suddenly opened up, and Patrick didn't. He didn't need to yell. The weight of the truth was doing all the work. Jake shoved. He leaned back in his chair and stood up. You're kidding, right? Tell me this is a joke. Walter just stayed quiet. Alice glanced back and forth between them. Dad, she said, is that? Walter opened his mouth, then closed it again, his hands shaking now. It was barely perceptible, but enough. Claire is my daughter, he said finally, his voice hoarse. I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how you missed what Alice said. As you leaned back from the table, you set the guidelines for how we should communicate and what should I wear and who should I invite for dinner? And you didn't know how to tell us we had a sister? Jake turned to. Hey, Patrick. How do you know all this? I saw her, talked to her, and even watched her call him Dad, like it was nothing. Patrick's voice was steady. He didn't deny it. Jake let out a sharp breath and walked out without saying anything else to Alice. Sank back in her chair, her eyes unfocused. Her husband reached for her hand, but he pulled it away. And Walter just stayed seated, staring at the cake while Patrick watched everything unfold. He didn't feel proud or vindicated. He just felt tired. For a moment. He thought maybe he should have waited, should have talked to Walter again, tried to come up with a plan. But the damage was done now, and part of him just couldn't bring himself to regret it. Someone had to break the silence, and no one else was going to take it on. And then he hit a moment he hadn't seen coming, a quiet knock on the door. One of the servers opened it and leaned in a bit. Sorry to interrupt, but there's a woman here. So, a kid says she's on the lookout for Walter, and just like that, Walter's head shot up. Patrick noticed. She turned sharply, and you invited her. Walter looked a bit sheepish. I thought it was interesting. As the room buzzed with tension, everyone stayed still. Then, the door opened wider, and CLA stepped in. Malik stepped in, holding her hand, and she smiled a bit shyly, clearly not fully aware of what was happening. She was walking into the storm. And Malik tugged her forward, excited. There he is. Malik shouted, pointing at Grandpa, we found the room. Claire's smile faded the second. She glanced around and froze. The silence lingered. And no one was there. Alice was, with her frozen hands clenched in her lap. One of the cousins whispered something under his breath. Meanwhile, Malik, completely oblivious, dashed over to Walter and hugged his waist. Walter placed a hand on his head. Hi, buddy, he said, his voice warm. CLA, feeling flat and strained, looked at Patrick, who held her gaze without blinking. Patrick stepped back and let her take it all in. The table, the cake, everything. Staring faces, the tension in the air so thick it was almost audible. CLA pulled. Malik crouched down softly and whispered something in his ear. He looked a bit confused and a little disappointed, but CLA nodded, straightened up, and looked at Walter. You didn't tell them? She said. Honestly, I was just going to say no. I could tell you were hoping someone else would take care of it for you. She glanced around again, and it was silent. I'm sorry, she said. Mostly to Malik, who? She stood beside her, feeling small and still. This was a mistake. With that thought, she turned and walked away. Walter sat back down. His hand wrapped tightly around something, and he didn't even touch his cake. No one else touched theirs either. Claire hadn't even made it 3. She stepped into the dining room and immediately sensed that something was off. It was like the air was heavy with it. There was this weird stillness in the room, you know? It felt heavy after the words had already done their thing. At first, nobody really looked at her directly. A couple of people glanced over, then quickly looked away, while others just stared at her like she was a surprising headline they never saw coming. Even Malik, who usually doesn't feel awkward, slowed down next to her. Glancing up and gripping her hand a bit tighter, Walter. Rose awkwardly leaned halfway out of his seat, saying it like he wasn't quite sure if he should be talking to her. It's hard to say if the name would help or hurt. CLA looked over the table, noticing the half-eaten plates and the untouched ones. In the odd quiet, she glanced over at Patrick, who was standing at the back with his arms crossed. Alice, looking pale and tight-lipped, folded her arms as she realized Jake was gone. She then turned back to Walter. She said it with a flat voice. Not needing any confirmation, and you didn't tell them. Walter opened his hands in a helpless gesture. I meant to, but I thought, no. You were really hoping it would stay clean. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she managed to keep her tone steady. After all, you invited me here. Realizing they had no idea, you brought my son into a room full of strangers. Expecting a warm welcome, Patrick stepped in. He moved forward, but CLA didn't pay him any mind. Mick was watching, his face tilted up toward her. Confusion was creeping in. Let's go, she said to him, keeping her tone gentle. We're not. Walter reached out like he wanted to stop her, but he just stayed put behind the chair. CLA turned around without saying anything else. She walked out, Malik's small hand still locked in hers. Patrick hesitated for just a moment. Before he followed, the doors swung closed behind him, cutting off the quiet noise. He caught up to them near the elevator at the restaurant and called out to her. She didn't stop walking. CLA, wait. She spun around in the hallway, her voice low, but, hey, what's going on? Patrick? Haven't you done enough already? I didn't realize he invited you, he said, and she laughed once, short and humorless. Does that make it better? Malik was looking up at the light fixtures. And I could tell he knew something was off, even though he was trying to play it cool. I had no idea he put you in that spot. Wait, you really didn't think about her? You didn't consider me or Malik either. You really thought about what would hurt your dad the most, and you used us to get to him. Patrick's shoulders tensed up. That's not cool. Isn't it fair? She stepped closer, keeping her voice steady. You found out he. So, you found out about a secret daughter, and instead of digging deeper, You just went ahead and tossed a grenade into dinner, huh? Hey, Patrick, you didn't mention anything. You didn't even give me a heads up. He took a breath. I held it and then exhaled slowly. You're right, I didn't, but I had a right to know, so. I thought I was walking into a family dinner, but she said he wanted something else. He invited you to be part of something without mentioning it to anyone else. That spot wasn't for me. CLA was staring at the elevator doors like she was ready to push them open, and you just stood there and let it happen. So Patrick went silent. She wasn't mistaken. The instant she walked in through the door, everything changed. He knew it was going to get worse before it got better, and he didn't say anything, just watched. I'm sorry he did that. Claire didn't say anything. She just glanced at Malik and then back at Patrick. We're all set now. The elevator's here, and she stepped in with Malik, giving a quick nod. Without any warmth. The doors slid shut in the dining room where Alice was. She began to gather her things while her husband hovered nearby, keeping an eye on Walter with a watchful gaze. Walter hadn't touched his cake, while the rest of the table was in various states of enjoyment. There were moments of stunned silence and soft whispers as Patrick walked back in and took a seat. She sat down next to her brother and said quietly, "You really couldn't have done that somewhere private?" She deserved to. She wanted to be recognized. She didn't deserve to be humiliated. Patrick just didn't respond. At the table, one of the cousins asked if they could leave. Walter hadn't said a word since CLA left. She seems kind, Alice. She added it after a long pause. Is she after money? Patrick looked at her, startled. What? That's what Jake said. Before he left, Patrick shook his head, saying no. She didn't even know. He never told us. She was totally caught off guard. Alice glanced down at her plate, twirling her fork in circles. I just don't get how someone can keep an entire person a secret. He must have really convinced them. He thought he was protecting us. Alice let out a small, bitter laugh. What a sister, right? Walter finally spoke up, breaking the silence that guilt had wrapped around him. Patrick turned, surprised to hear his voice. I really thought it would mess everything up. Your mom had just passed away, and I had no idea. How do I be a parent to the kids I already have? I never thought I could manage more. Alice's jaw was clenched, so you know it's serious. So, I just buried her. But Walter said, I didn't bury her. I just didn't let her come up for air. Patrick stood up again. He just couldn't sit there any longer. I'm going home, he said. No one. Later that night, Patrick found himself sitting alone in his apartment. The lights dimmed. The city was humming quietly, and through the windows, the evening hadn't left him. He was still sharp. It was like CLA's words really hit home, you know? They stuck with me the most. You used us to get to him, didn't you? I really didn't want that to be the case, but maybe there's some truth to it. Perhaps it's just impossible to separate justice from bitterness when. Walter found himself unable to sleep, so he decided to pull out an old photo album. Mom had made it when they were kids. And it was just sitting there, all dusty and forgotten at the back of a shelf. Inside, it had the usual stuff. Photos of Halloween costumes, soccer trophies, and birthday cakes that are a bit uneven. He flipped through the candles slowly, noticing how the colors had faded and the corners had curled, until a small square photo slipped out and fell to the floor. He picked it up. Walter was sitting on a park bench, a baby wrapped in his lap. A light yellow blanket in the photo didn't have a label. Patrick flipped it over, but there was nothing written. The baby didn't look like any of them. He would have remembered that blanket, that photo, but he hadn't seen Claire. So it wasn't just a one-time visit or something he did out of obligation. Walter had held her, maybe even smiled for the camera. Patrick stared at the image for a long time, not of. Walter hadn't embraced sentimentality, but rather, it interrupted the narrative he had created for himself. He just kept his feelings for her under wraps. Maybe even made an effort in his own awkward way. To be present, Patrick slipped the photo back into the album and closed it carefully. Then, he walked to the kitchen. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope, then scribbled a name on the front, Claire. He wasn't sure what he was doing, was going to say yet. But he knew this wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The photo just sat on Patrick's desk for days, untouched. Every time he walked by, he couldn't help but glance at it after slipping it out of the album. Walter looked almost gentle in the image, but he was still unsure what to make of it. Not just younger, but more relaxed. Like he hadn't yet settled into the man Patrick remembered and the baby Claire. She definitely looked like she belonged there, all cozy in his arms. But it didn't really make up for anything. Not at all. But it was complicated. The narrative Patrick had been nursing since that awful dinner made him think Walter had completely buried CLA. But maybe the story had more twists than he'd let on. Still, none of that changed what had happened. The silence. Afterward, it was almost done, but Jake didn't call. Alice just sent a quick text. Hey, you really should have given us a heads up. I'm not sure I can handle this at the moment, Walter. They didn't reach out at all, no apology, no follow-up, just silence, like the family. Patrick didn't hold it against CLA for disappearing. He understood it was more about embarrassment and confusion, like going into hibernation. He sent a text 2 days after dinner. But she didn't reply, so he didn't reach out again. Instead, he drove by her apartment a couple of times over the next few weeks, especially when he spotted Malik on the balcony with a setup. Having dinosaur figurines battle it out while adding some hilarious sound effects is just too much fun. Claire sat next to him, a book in hand and her leg tucked under her. Patrick didn't pause he just wanted to hear anything, as long as he knew they were okay. The second time, the balcony he hung around for just a few minutes before he decided to leave. He kept telling himself that she needed space. It was a Tuesday, and he was sharing it, but that guilt just wouldn't fade away. He was right in the thick of a meeting about a property deal in Boston when his phone started buzzing nonstop. Finally, he decided to excuse himself and step into the hallway. The number was unfamiliar, but the voice on the line. Hi there, this is M. Whitaker, the assistant principal at Ridge Elementary. Hey, Mr. Carroll. Just wanted to let you know that you're listed as Malik Hunter's emergency contact. Patrick's stomach dropped when he heard that. He was worried. But don't worry, Malik is fine. Just a little something going on. His mom hasn't shown up for pickup, and we can't get in touch with her. Patrick didn't pry any further. Mick left the office without saying a word. Canceled all his meetings for the day and made it across town in record time. He was hanging out in the front office, swinging his legs and chatting with a school aide about a field trip when he spotted Patrick. He brightened up and said, Hey, what are you doing here? I came to get you. Did Mom forget? Once more? Patrick mentioned something like that while crouching down to zip up the boy's backpack. Hey, let's go check on her. Claire's apartment building was pretty quiet, nestled between a coffee shop and a farm. PHY buzzed us in. He knocked twice, but there was still no answer. Malik tried knocking again, but still nothing. Now he was feeling a bit unsure. He hovered behind her. Mom always takes a nap after lunch. He offered, but she usually hears him. As the buzzer rang, Patrick's grip on the doorknob tightened. He told Malik to hang back for a moment. He walked down the hallway and gave the knob a turn. It was unlocked. He stepped into the living room. The room was tidy, not exactly spotless, but you could tell it was lived in. There was a glass of water sitting on the table, and the door was open. There was a notebook and a blanket, half folded on the couch. He called her name once. Then again, he didn't get a response, so he walked down the short hallway to the bedroom. There she was, lying on her side with one arm tucked underneath her. Her pillow still in jeans and a sweatshirt. For a moment, he thought maybe she'd just fallen asleep, but it was too still, too quiet, and it felt all wrong. He hurried across the room and reached out to touch her. He gently shook her shoulder, but there was no reaction. Her skin felt cold, and he couldn't recall So, I dialed 911 and pulled Malik back outside, trying to figure out what to do next. So, while we were just hanging around waiting for the ambulance, it felt like nothing was happening. But then, out of nowhere, the paramedics showed up really fast. So, the question came up. Did she say anything about feeling sick or having any heart issues in the past? She had some problems, and he wasn't sure if she was on medication or not. He just didn't know the answers. A doctor with kind eyes and a straightforward way of speaking told him that at the hospital. What if her heart was like an undiagnosed defect? You know, the kind that could have been caught in time. She had the right skin at the right time, but it often went unnoticed until it was too late. She just hadn't felt anything. She never woke up. Malik fell asleep that night, curled up on a plastic chair in the pediatric waiting room, a dinosaur. Patrick sat beside him, still in his work clothes, with something clutched in one hand. In the hospital, everything felt so air-dry and artificial around him. He couldn't quite recall the last time he felt this completely out of his depth. He dealt with angry shareholders and lawsuits, and went through national interviews. But none of that really prepared him for the challenge of explaining death. To a child who still believed in Santa, he called out to Walter as the line rang 3 times. It took a few tries before it finally connected. "It's me," Patrick said, but Walter didn't respond at all. "It's CLA." He went on, "and she's gone." The silence stretched on for so long. Patrick thought the call had dropped. And then what happened to her heart? Something went undetected today, and there was another long pause. "Malik," Walter asked. "He's with me. Is he okay?" "He doesn't know what happened yet, and I'm not sure how to explain it." It felt like Walter's voice was a bit smaller. "You know? Do you want me to come over?" "No," Patrick said quickly. "Just thought you should know." So Walter didn't put up a fight. He just said thank you and hung up when Malik woke up. He quickly scanned the area for his mom. Patrick felt a bit lost and wasn't sure how to start, so he just stood there. He began with the truth he could handle. "She's not coming back tonight," he said. She saw the boy flinch. "And just barely, she went on a trip." Patrick shook his head. "No, she got really sick, and the doctors just couldn't fix it." Malik was staring at her. He was probably waiting for the part where he mentioned she'd wake up later or that she was. Malik was just resting somewhere else, and when it didn't come, he turned toward the window and stayed quiet for a long time. Patrick sat next to him, feeling a bit uncertain about whether staying quiet was the right move, but it was all he could do. He didn't cry until he got home and discovered one of Malik's tiny socks stuck in the cuff of his coat. He just sat there. I sat on the edge of the bed, just staring at it for what felt like ages, really trying to push away any thoughts about what had happened. The funeral was small and quiet, with more empty chairs than filled ones. Patrick took care of everything since no one else was around to help. He reached out to the service and picked a nice, modest chapel nearby. In the park, CLA would take Malik and pick out the music she enjoyed from a playlist he had once heard her listening to. So, the apartment CLA, it didn't really have a church vibe, you know? It just didn't seem like that kind of place, and Patrick wasn't about to let anyone act like it was. He had on a black sweater that was a bit oversized, with the sleeves bunching up around his wrists. He didn't say much, just held on. Walter came and stood there, holding on to his mother's old denim jacket the whole time, gripping the sleeve like it was a lifeline in a storm. He was at the back, quiet, his face pale. He didn't say a word to anyone, just nodded to Patrick. He met her once, but there was nothing more to it. Jake and Alice never really connected. Jake shot a quick message saying he can't make it. He also mentioned to let him know if you need anything. Alice didn't respond at all, and there weren't too many guests, just one neighbor, I think. A woman from the school office, someone Claire had worked with for a short time, was there. Patrick sat through the service, listening to A. The pastor read the usual lines about peace and memory. Words that seemed to belong to someone else, not him. He felt like he couldn't trust himself to say anything that wouldn't end up sounding wrong. So he took Mallet back to his place. The silence in the penthouse wrapped around them like fog, creeping into the corners and spreading through the rooms that had. Once it felt too quiet. Malik didn't ask any questions, didn't cry. He just carried the weight. He carried the jacket with him from room to room and eventually curled up with it on the sofa, saying nothing, just staring out the window. Patrick didn't push. He just called around to try to find a window at the skyline. There was a will for the CLAs, but there wasn't any official guardian designation or anything like that. Her finances were pretty sparse, with just a few scattered savings accounts and some debt. So, it's about the school payment plan, right? There are no siblings involved, and there's no next of kin listed except for Walter. Got it. Her name got lost in some old paperwork when social services checked in the next day. Patrick was upfront. I'm not legally listed, but he's with me and he's sticking around. Stay with me until we sort this out. The woman on the phone didn't push back, but she made it clear that someone in the family had to step up. Patrick hung up, saying he needed to step forward soon, or else there were procedures to follow. They called a family meeting and gathered in Alice's kitchen the following evening. So, Walter, Alice, and Jake had flown back in for a meeting. It was the first one. It was the first time they'd all been in the same room since that dinner, and you could really feel the tension in the air. Patrick explained everything in a calm manner. While Claire hadn't left anything official, if the court decides, Malik would need a legal guardian, and if no one in the family steps up, he would end up becoming a ward of the state. Walter sat with his hands folded in his lap while little Alice walked back and forth, keeping an eye on Jake. Leaning against the counter with my arms crossed, I said, "Not it, Jake. First thing I have to do is to. I've got kids, a job that takes me across 4 states every month, and a marriage that's barely holding on. I'm not. Patrick turned to Al and said, adopting someone I don't even know? Alice just shook her head. Hey, I really can't. I'm sorry, but I just can't. I'm working 60 hours a week, and I barely have any time. I can't have pets since I'm hardly ever home, and Mick's really sweet, but honestly, he's pretty much a. So this stranger turned out to be family. I had no idea he was even out there until last month when Walter cleared things up. I can help him out financially with anything he needs, but I can't raise a child, not now. Patrick looked at them one by one, his own blood. It shouldn't have happened. It caught him off guard, but it still stung. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. He stood there, appreciating the clarity, and didn't wait for any replies. One night, Malik was sitting on the floor of Patrick's living room, casually putting together a small Lego structure. Not really putting in much effort. Snapping pieces together and pulling them apart. His dinner sat untouched on the table. The boy finally looked up. He got up and asked if he was going to be sent somewhere, feeling a bit like a lost puppy. Patrick just sat there. He leaned back against the couch beside him. No, you're staying with me, but someone mentioned that I needed a ride. Mick glanced at him, but there was no hope in his eyes, not even a hint of it. He felt a sense of relief mixed with quiet, tired anticipation, almost as if he was just waiting to be proven wrong. Patrick gave the Lego structure a little nudge with his toe. I got you, kid, Malik said with a quick nod. He crawled up beside him and settled in without saying a word when bedtime came. When asked to sleep in Patrick's bed, he didn't hesitate at all. He stayed awake for a long time after that. Malik had dozed off while gazing at the ceiling, with every to-do list, scheduled meeting, and deadline swirling around in his mind, dissolving into white noise. His entire life had revolved around control and timing. He had planned his future with such precision, almost like it was a product launch. Now, none of it mattered. He glanced down at the small figure next to him, curled up toward the edge. He held CLA's jacket as if it were an extension of himself, and then something changed, something shifted. It's not about a sudden rush of feelings. It's more like a gradual, steady realization that this wasn't. For a while, he wasn't just a stand-in. Malik didn't have anyone else, and now there's Patrick. I really didn't want him to try making breakfast that first morning. He almost set off the smoke alarm. I never knew pancakes needed so much attention or that kids could feel so passionately about crispy eggs. Malik was lounging at the kitchen island, still in his pajamas, watching with a blend of horror and fascination as Patrick. He tossed a burnt pancake into the trash and quietly grumbled about how he'd never trust online recipes again. Recipes again? Can we just have cereal? Malik asked, pushing the milk toward him. With both hands, probably for the best, Patrick said as he grabbed 2 bowls. I'm mentally adding, learn to cook like a normal adult, to his growing list of things to do. With all the responsibilities, the learning curve was pretty steep. Patrick hadn't really had to think about after-school snacks or screen time before. He had always lived in neat, organized spaces that didn't include toys. It was like the penthouse had turned into a playground, with cars stuck in the rug and sticky fingerprints all over the place. A little bit taken over by a tiny, wild explorer, with crayon drawings hanging around. From the fridge beside some post-it notes that have reminders for the investor call, a stuffed. Patrick often found a dinosaur on his pillow. And the dishwasher seemed to be running all the time. Laundry piled up faster, and there were days when he barely remembered to check his email. He made mistakes, lots of them. I got Malik this amazing tablet loaded with all the educational apps you could think of. But it turns out he mostly just wanted. He decided to play a simple soccer game that was free on Patrick's old phone, and then he signed Malik up for a beginner cello class. I'm really proud of finding something enriching, but then Malik came home all soaked and said he hated it, and just. Patrick really wanted to play real sports, but he had to call and cancel. Feeling a bit embarrassed about it, they decided to go for it and signed him up for soccer, just like he had asked in the first place. They started to find a rhythm, Patrick. He started leaving the office earlier than usual, delegating more tasks, and began to miss some things. He stood on the sidelines at Malik's first soccer practice, not feeling the need to apologize for anything, wearing sunglasses on, trying to play it cool while the other parents chatted away about carpool schedules and, after every drill, Malik, all sweaty and buzzing with excitement, ran up to him, completely unaware of the school fundraisers happening around them. Malik was eager to show off a new move and share what Coach Mike said. So he fired off 100 questions before bed. I've got some questions about the moon, how elevators work, and what CLA was like when she was little. What do you think, Patrick? He answered what he could and was honest when he didn't know. Malik didn't seem to. There were definitely some days that felt heavy, you know? Like, there were nights when Malik just couldn't catch a break and couldn't sleep at all. When he'd wake up and shuffle into Patrick's room without saying a word, he'd climb into bed and curl up close. He rarely cried. But when it happened, it was like a sudden wave of quiet tears during a movie that brought back memories or was sparked by a drawing. One night at school, Patrick came across someone sitting on the floor outside the bathroom, legs drawn up. It was someone else's mom. And tight. I think I forgot what her voice sounds like, Malik. Patrick sat down next to him and said, "That's okay. We can jot down the things you remember to keep them safe." Malik nodded but didn't say anything else that night. A few days later, while they were brushing their teeth, Mick asked, "Do you think Mom's?" Patrick paused, wondering why she would be mad at him. "Is it because I don't cry that much? I think Patrick should cry more." With the toothbrush still in his hand, she reached out and pulled him into a hug. "She's not upset. She wouldn't want you to feel bad. Sometimes, for a smile, she'd want you to be okay." Malik didn't say anything. He just held on. It went on a bit longer than usual, and Patrick didn't let go first. It was Walter who started. "I'm calling more often." Not really to chat with Patrick, but to ask about Malik and what he's been reading. Patrick was a bit hesitant at first, wondering if he was eating enough while thinking about the games he liked. What Walter really wanted, but in the end, they came to terms with the fact that the calls weren't about sorting out their own issues. In their relationship, they were focused on holding on to a piece of CLA. Walter sent over a box of old children's books one day. Malik opened each one like it was a special gift and lined them up, week by week, puzzle by puzzle. On the windowsill, Patrick thought it was time for a visit, so they headed back to room 407. It was a cloudy Saturday afternoon when Malik knocked before just walking right in. Something Patrick wasn't used to. He taught him, and you could really see Walter's face light up when he spotted them. He seemed a bit thinner, though. It took him a bit longer to get up. But he was definitely more alert than Patrick remembered. Malik just kept talking nonstop. He was chatting with Walter about soccer and the new robot kit they had started. He also mentioned how he managed to beat Patrick at a memory game 3 times in a row. Walter listened, nodding and laughing at all the right moments. Just like people do when they're enjoying a conversation. They really want to know more. Patrick was just sitting in the corner, watching it all happen. The connection was already there. The boy had known him for less time than you might think. It had been more than a year, but the bond felt genuine. After some time, Mick strolled into the courtyard. Walter, with a cup of fish food he'd snagged from the front desk, stayed put, breathing a bit heavier now. "He kind of reminds me of," he said it quietly, reminiscing about how she used to light up a room when she was around. Little Patrick took a moment to think. He wasn't quite sure how to respond. Walter added, "I was trying to be cruel. But honestly, I just didn't know how to undo it once I made that choice." The choice to keep her away from everything became tougher to acknowledge over time. Shame turned into a routine, and as you think it's too late to make things right, Patrick found himself gazing at the bookshelf, where some of Malik's drawings were now displayed. "Why is that? Didn't you say that after Mom passed away, Walter seemed down because I didn't want you to?" Patrick leaned in closer to see what kind of man I had been. Walter shrugged. "Now I wish I had told her I was proud of her, that I felt lucky to." Patrick didn't say he forgave him. He didn't think he could, but he has her at all. He didn't get up and leave. Instead, he stayed there quietly with him for a while, listening to the distant sound of laughter. That night, with the garden sounds trickling in through the open window, Malik asked if he could sleep in Patrick's bed again. He brought his pillow and dinosaur, and after they turned the lights out, he whispered, "I think Grandpa's sad, but he still smiles." As I was talking, Patrick pulled the blanket up around himself and gave a kiss to the top of his head. "Your head, that's your superpower, kid." The days blend into something a bit quieter and steadier. Patrick began to measure his days by school pickups and bedtime stories rather than board meetings and conference calls. I figured out which snacks Malik likes, how to braid a friendship bracelet, and how to decode a week's worth of stuff. There's something really emotional about just a single look across the breakfast table. It's funny how the big stuff, like formal guardianship, seems to move at a snail's pace. All wrapped up in that moment. There's a lot of paperwork and waiting around, but those small things really added up quickly. A backpack with a forgotten toothbrush swapped out for one featuring a dinosaur on the handle. The room that used to just have spare furniture is now filled with Lego piles and pencil drawings proudly taped to the wall. Patrick gave Malik the room down the hall from his own, repainting the walls a soft mossy green. CLA would have liked it. Malik got to pick out the bedding, and of course, it had rocket ships on it. They chose posters together and hung them up, making everything glow. Dark stars on the ceiling, shelves filled with books and games, and that box of photos Claire had tucked away in her closet. There are some pictures of Malik as a baby, and a few show her smiling with him on beaches or on the front steps. Patrick didn't hide them. He let them be seen. Malik asks questions, even the tough ones, and the adoption came through early. Spring at the courthouse wasn't anything dramatic, just a quiet judge with a tired smile. Patrick stood next to Malik, wearing a button-down shirt, as they exchanged a handshake. He hadn't ironed properly, holding his hand while the paperwork was read aloud. Malik had insisted on bringing his. The stuffed dinosaur sat proudly on the bench next to them. When the judge announced it was over, Malik looked up and, "So," I asked, "does this mean we're really a team now?" Patrick just nodded, too full to respond. They chatted for a bit, then headed out for pancakes. They mentioned to the waitress that it was a special day, but didn't go into details about why. So, I went ahead and added an extra scoop of whipped cream. Then Alice showed up first, and she arrived one Saturday morning with a bag full of art supplies and a box of cookies, feeling a bit unsure of what to say but giving it a shot. "So," Malik greeted her politely, feeling more curious than nervous, and she didn't push him. They just knelt down and suggested drawing something together, and before they knew it, they spent the whole afternoon in the kitchen. When she left, the table elbows were all marked up with ink. She hugged Patrick for the first time in years, while Jake took his time. I didn't get a call, but then a letter showed up 2 weeks later. It was 3 pages long and typed, which was a bit unusual. Be careful, he didn't really excuse his absence. He just explained it and mentioned that he wasn't proud of it. He talked about how he dealt with everything and apologized for jumping to conclusions and for leaving Malik behind when he really needed him. Someone asked if they could meet up sometime. "No pressure," Malik was told. He said he would only come if he brings snacks. Patrick told Shake to show up with pretzels. After that, things started to change. Walter's health began to decline not long after the calls stopped, and then the visits followed suit. His voice got quieter, and sometimes he would zone out in the middle of a chat. But every time Malik walked through the door, you could see something in him sharpen. He'd sit up a bit straighter, ask questions, and chuckle at the same stories he'd already heard twice that week. But room 407 felt different now. The walls were covered with Malik's art, spaceships, animals, all in a messy but colorful display. There's a portrait that says me, along with Grandpa Patrick, and he's added some framed photos of Claire when she was a baby. As a teenager, I remember smiling next to a younger Walter in that same courtyard. There was a quiet sort of peace there now, like something that felt unfinished had finally begun to settle during one visit. The rain drummed steadily outside, blurring the windows. Malik, with soft streaks in his hair, sat next to Walter and asked about Claire's favorite. Walter answered each question about his favorite toy, food, and color in a distant way. He shared some really sweet stories that Patrick had never heard before. Like when CLA was a toddler sneaking chocolate from the. She was reminiscing about a camping trip they took together when she was 12, recalling how she used to hum while going about her tasks. Patrick stood off to the side, listening, and he was really struck by how easy it all seemed. The version of Walter who remembered birthdays and bedtime psalms wasn't the one he had grown up with. He had spent his. Growing up, I danced around silence, mistaking coldness for control, and now I find myself in the quiet moments between stories. Patrick came to a realization he hadn't wanted to face. Walter had changed, but it was too late for him to do anything about it, especially when Malik took off. Walter leaned back, feeling tired but still clear-headed as he headed to the garden to feed the koi. He said he's got her in him, not just the face, but the way he talks and the way he looks too. The light filled every room. Patrick nodded, and Walter closed his eyes for a moment. He did what I never had the guts to do, and he said it without any bitterness, just. So, Patrick didn't respond. And honestly, there wasn't much more to discuss. Walter has passed away. 2 weeks later, the memorial was just for family. No announcements or anything like that. Patrick put together the eulogies with Alice, who brought along the flowers that Malik had picked. Jake arrived at the burial site quieter than usual, but he was steady. Malik handed him something. Patrick folded a sheet of paper and whispered, "Can I read it?" Patrick nodded. Malik stood at the edge of the grave, his hands shaking as he read a short poem he'd written with some help from. His teacher said it didn't rhyme, it wasn't neat, but it was filled with simple words. Talked about stories and peppermints, and how sometimes people change, even if it takes a long time. When he finished, I put the paper on top of the grave, right next to a little drawing of a rocket ship that said, "To Grandpa from." Malik. Patrick stood beside him for a bit, one hand resting on his shoulder while the wind played around them. After a few months, life settled back into its new rhythm with school lunches and weekends. There were always these cartoon arguments about bedtime. Patrick never really got used to it, but he didn't want to fight it either. It was better to keep adapting to stay alert. He found himself getting caught up in it. Sometimes I find myself humming, not really anything specific, just a sound. And then one day, I realized that. Claire would often do the same thing one late afternoon after school with Patrick and Mick. I swung by the retirement home to say hi to the staff and drop off some extra puzzles that Walter had ordered but never got around to picking up. When I opened the lobby, it looked just like before, same armchairs, same dough. As they walked in, Malik slowed down, taking a look around at the painting near the elevator. "This is where we met," he said. Patrick smiled and replied, "Yeah, you came up and asked if I was here. I was just thinking about my grandpa. I thought you were lost, Malik." "You looked really serious," someone said. Patrick let out a low laugh. "I was." They walked on. As they walked through the lobby hand in hand and stepped back outside into the late sunlight, Malik asked, "Do you think Mom can you see us now?" Patrick didn't answer right away as they reached the sidewalk. Before he looked down at him, "I think she sees everything." Spring gave way to summer. The city just kept on going. Like it always does, moving at its usual pace, maybe a bit too fast, filled with all the noise and deadlines you'd expect. But Patrick had stopped keeping track of time like he used to. Mornings now started with cereal and mismatched socks instead of a schedule. Evenings were filled with homework struggles and reading the same book over and over again. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. Nights were noisy, and some days felt endless. But there was a joy in it, a joy that really built something special. Little by little, things piled up over time, and eventually, Patrick took a moment to look around and noticed he didn't really miss the life he used to have. One morning, Malik just started calling him Dad, without any fuss. In July, they were at the kitchen counter, pouring pancake batter that Patrick had made. I finally figured out how to keep them golden instead of burnt when Malik asked if we could head to the Science Museum. So Patrick said maybe Saturday, right? Mick replied, "Okay, Dad." As Patrick reached for the syrup, he didn't say a word at first. He just glanced over and let the word sink in. It wasn't forced. It wasn't uncertain. It was as natural as anything else when they talked to each other, and he didn't bother to correct it. He just smiled and handed it to him without making a big deal out of it. The adoption certificate was framed and sitting in Malik's room, not because Patrick pushed for it, but simply because Malik wanted it there. He had taped it there himself, right next to a drawing of the two of them at a soccer game, and it was all a bit crooked underneath it. He'd written to my family in his handwriting, and the house had changed as well. It looked like someone actually lived there. So there are shoes all piled up at the door. Homework spread out on the dining table, and the fridge is just covered in stuff. Artwork, magnets, a school calendar, and a note from Alice that said, "Sleep over next Friday. Bring snacks." Jake visited For a few weeks, I always brought something small for Malik, a puzzle, a book, or a bag of his favorite pretzels. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The chats between the siblings can still get a bit rocky now and then, but they're putting in the effort, and that's what really matters. Walter's stuff was all sorted out and donated. But Patrick held on to a couple of small things, like one of his old watches and a letter. There was this opener that looked like a ship, and a bunch of photos he discovered in a shoebox tucked away under the bed. One of them was of Claire when it was probably B12 just chilling on a dock, feet dangling in the water, having a good laugh at someone off camera. Patrick caught that moment perfectly. one and set it on Malik's nightstand. Nobody really brought up Walter in a big way, but every now and then, Malik would bring him up. How he used to say funny words like gadzooks or how he enjoyed peppermints. Those memories felt gentle and easy to handle. One weekend in early autumn, Patrick took Malik headed upstate to a quiet lake that CLA had once jotted down in a notebook. It wasn't a big trip, just the two of us. They had a cabin and a couple of fishing poles. But they didn't really know how to use them at night. They gathered around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and enjoying the sounds around them. Malik leaned his head on Patrick's arm and asked, "Is this what family feels like?" Patrick looked at him. He paused for a long moment before answering. "Yeah," he said, "I think this is exactly what it is." It seemed like he didn't need to say anything else. Malik nodded, feeling satisfied, and reached for another marshmallow. Patrick watched the fire flicker and crackle, thinking about how it had all started with a chance. In the lobby of a retirement home, a child asked an innocent question, and suddenly, a door opened to a piece of the past he had long forgotten. I never knew it existed. What started as a disruption turned into a lifeline. It's a second chance, not just for Malik, but for himself. He never intended to be anyone's father. He never expected to feel this kind of love, but here he is, sitting next to the boy who had completely transformed his life and created room for joy he couldn't even think about going back. There was still grief. Some of it just lingers. Claire is gone. Walter is gone. And all that time lost feels heavy. It might not be recoverable, but there was definitely some growth. Real, messy, beautiful growth. And now, there's laughter filling a home that used to be so quiet. Remember those Saturday soccer games and Tuesday night science sessions? Good times. Experiments and those lazy Sunday mornings packed with cartoon reruns and spilled juice, plus hand-drawn cards for Father's Day brought up some questions at bedtime that really made Patrick stop and think for a moment. Answering and, above all, there was Malik, who came into his life as a stranger and became like a son during those quiet moments, walking home from school, sharing a joke over dinner, or watching him sleep, all curled up with that same stuffed dinosaur. Patrick felt something he hadn't felt in years, not just peace, but if you like this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up. It really supports the channel. And if you're interested, feel free to stick around for more. If you love heartwarming and emotional stories like this, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss out. Hey everyone, I just uploaded something new, and I'd really love to hear what you think about it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you in the next story.